Mr. Rivera, you're on the phone.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Is anyone else on the phone? All right, thank you.
I got it originally was set for the 3rd week in June, and I'll delay it. I'll delay it. Hopefully get in the fall or something like that. But then they're like, oh, they bumped it back to 2 weeks.
All right, probably we'll get started since today's kind of a packed day. Welcome, everybody. This is a work session of the Anchorage Assembly. Today is May 31st. It is 10:42 a.m. We're here to discuss AM unnumbered. It's probably numbered, but I don't have the number. 2024 recommendation of award for proprietary contract with Chugach Electric Association for the Municipality of Anchorage, Port of Alaska for the microgrid battery energy storage system project, $3,600,000. So let's do introductions.
Randy Salt. George Martinez.
Mark Littlefield.
Karen Bronga.
Zach Johnson.
Anna Brawley.
I don't think Scott's mic was working. Scott Myers and Christopher Constant. And on the phone, Mr. Rivera.
Felix Rivera.
Thank you. And Ms. Alatel will be here in just a moment. And so Ms. Alatel pulled this item for a briefing, a work session on what the plan is here. I don't see a representative from Chugach, Alaska or Chugach Electric or Launch Alaska. So we just have the port. Why don't you go ahead and get started?
Hello, I'm Jim Jager from Port of Alaska. If we want to put this presentation, I've given you a deck of slides, but I think we can go right to slide 6. Most of it's just background information if you have questions later on.
I would note that Ms. Alatel just arrived.
So we can go up to the. Hi, Ben. So we can go up to slide 6. It's the graphic of the. Keep one more. There we go. So this contract is to support the Port Power Plan. The Port Power Plan is basically our. It's a series of phased projects that each project has independent utility, and they'll combine into a port power plan that will add resiliency and better economics and reliability to the port's power system. If we want to go up to the basic system is that we're going to turn the port into a microgrid, what's called a connected microgrid, meaning that if the main grid goes down for the rail belt power grid, we will be able to island the port and we'll have power generation available on the port and be able to maintain port operations even in the event of a grid outage. There will also be improvements within the port's power system so that things like seagulls deciding to land at the wrong spot and shutting down a transformer and taking the port out, we'll be able to switch around that, and we won't have local failures either as we move the system in. If you want to go to the next slide, please. So our strategy has been to develop a series of small phased projects that we can go out and finance, build, and prepare for the next generation of the project. One of the projects, the initial project involves creating the connected microgrid so that we'll use grid power most of the time. We can island the port and run off of our own power systems when the grid goes down. And we will have a battery that's going to help us manage that system. The initial project we started working on actually back in about 2018. In 2022, we got a grant from it's called the DCIP, Defense Community Infrastructure Program grant, that is basically funding the first phase of our project, which is to actually build the connections, the controls to create the microgrid, and the first phase of our battery. This project is basically taking that money and implementing the first phase. So we'll create the microgrid. It's a $5.3 million grant we got. It's a 70-30 match, which means for $5.3 million in federal money, we're matching with $2.3 million in local funds. And our proposal basically is to work with Chugach Electric Association, the local utility, have them on their side of the meter, build and manage the microgrid controls and the system that will allow our battery to kick in and support the port. And then on our side of the meter, we're going to take specs from Chugach to build a battery that will work with their system and work for our system. And that will create the better power environment for the port. And what this contract proposes to do is it wants to do the sole source contract with the utility to basically design our battery for, or give us the specifics for the battery that we can then go out and contract with a company to supply the battery, build the civil infrastructure that the battery needs to operate, run the plug right up to Chugach's system, and then Chugach, as part of this contract, will make the improvements on their side of the system that will let us plug into their grid. So basically, it's the interconnection for our microgrid, the microgrid controls, and then engineering support for our project is what we're asking Chugach to give us in this contract.
So I have a question. Is there a map of where you're proposing to lay these various infrastructure elements? Because this picture on slide 6, it's a cute rendering, but it doesn't provide any sense of how closely a hydrogen pipeline would come to residential properties or other infrastructure.
Okay, so first of all, the hydrogen is down the road. That is not part of this project, and it is not a project yet. It's just potential because a next phase of this project will be moving a generator that Chugach owns. It's called the Black Start generator. It's basically the generator that they would use to restart the grid in the event of an outage. That generator right now is physically located at the Ship Creek Power Plant, which is in the tsunami inundation area. So the thought is that we will eventually, and this will be a project that we're going after grant money for later this spring, we will move that generator up onto port property that's immediately adjacent to a substation on the port. And it will be inside of our microgrid. It will still function as a Black Start generator for the grid in the event of an outage. However, it will be above the tsunami inundation line. And in the event that we have to island the port, we'll have 5 to 7 megawatts of power generation capacity at the port. That generator is a dual fuel generator. Right now it's set up to run on natural gas or diesel fuel. It could potentially be set up to run on hydrogen. So going forward, as new fuel sources come out, that may be a way to power it. That is not part of the proposal right now. The hydrogen line just is showing that the potential would be there.
So in general terms, where is the substation?
The substation is on the road right below the Government Hill neighborhood on port property. You know where the emergency access gate is?
Mm-hmm.
It's basically downhill from that about 250 yards.
So a map will be very helpful information.
Actually, I have a picture in this, I believe. Yeah, if you go to slide 5, so go back one slide. If you see the emergency access road, you see the yellow road is our current emergency access road. And
Gotta take your mic with you. Sorry.
okay, I'll point. So right now, this is the Chugach substation. That's an existing substation.
So practically speaking, a hydrogen line may be within a very close proximity to a handful of homes. So it's definitely a concern on on that part of it. Secondarily to all of that, I think that I'm probably not the only one that is suspicious of providing Chugach Electric broad latitude to begin implementing major infrastructure proposals without some process to check in with the assembly and the administration to understand how far afield that they're moving. And so I think that some kind of a preliminary work plan that would communicate to us how this is supposed to work so that we can understand where the checkpoints are going to be and not just a blank slate for them to design and put forward a proposal that may or may not actually meet the interests of the municipality would be a wise element.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I was going to say this contract has nothing to do with that cartoon.
I'm not just talking about
I
hydrogen,
understand that,
talking
but-
about the whole thing.
But this contract has nothing to do with further phases. All this contract does, the scope is very tight. It has to do with the microgrid controls and the first phase of a battery.
I thought you said that it also has to do with, hold on, let me see if I can find it. I wrote it down. The actual plan for laying out the infrastructure.
No, the plan is for the battery specifications. So basically, because the battery plugs into their grid, it needs to comply with their system. So that they're giving us the exact specifications of what battery will be able to work for both our system and their system. The intention is to eventually contract to have Chugach actually maintain and operate the battery on the port's behalf, because we're not electrical experts. They are the electrical experts. The contract would basically give us first use of the power, but it would also enable Chugach to use the battery to help provide
Right.
grid
So,
services.
yeah, I'm not questioning the value, the various values. I'm questioning the actual, where it's going to sit, how it's going to work in relationship to my neighbors and people I have to see every day. So if I'm hearing you correctly, you're saying this will not come forward with a preliminary set of drawings that will say, this goes here, this goes here, this
No.
goes here. Okay, thank you. Ms. Elton.
Thank you. So I have a couple of questions, primarily out of the AM. So one, I noticed the period of performance goes back to May 1 of this year. Not real thrilled to see something come before us that goes backwards in time. So kind of curious why we're going backwards instead of making it for the date that
This
it's
has to do
approval.
with the grant stipulations and the spending deadlines on the grant. And we've been trying to move forward with this contract for more than a year and have had various issues. First, there was a debate about whether we could do a sole source with Chugach Electric. Code says we can.
Okay, so that's fine. So this lets you then charge expenses back to May 1 under the grant is kind of what I'm picking up
Although
on.
we basically have not run up any expenses. The only expenses I think that could go back as far as that are some site explorations that we've done and some work we did to get our NEPA agreement taken care of.
Okay. And then as to the sole source, right, we've had this grant since September 2022. Sole source, I see the justification for it, but how did we end up with this solution for the port's energy, creating energy redundancy for the port, right? Did we go out and ask the energy community, like, what are our options? Is this a best practice? What's happened from 2022 to this point to get us, headed down a sole source, battery-based set of operations for the port versus, I'm going to make something up. I'm not an energy expert. Wind or something else.
Going back to 2018, we've known that we've had power system issues. We initially started by working with Municipal Light and Power to get a second loop of power put in. We had one line coming into the port. If that line went out, we had no power at the port. So the initial project was to put a second line in. That has been installed. It goes through that substation we were just talking to, so that now if something happens, a truck hits a power pole and takes the power pole out, a substation goes out, any sort of thing like that, we have a second way that we can manually switch and bring power into the port within, ideally it would be microseconds. Right now, we're still probably within hours as opposed to microseconds. With the right controls, it'll be down to microseconds. That was the first phase of the project. As we did that, we started talking about the potential for a microgrid. Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson and the Department of Energy got very interested in that and said, hey, JBER wants to build a microgrid too. Could we plug the two microgrids in together? That freed up money for the Department of Energy's Sandia National Lab to fund a study for our microgrid battery and generator project. The feasibility study was completed. Basically, everybody said, gee, this is a good idea. Let's keep moving forward. We started moving forward with it. That was about the time ML&P was getting ready to be sold. ML&P got distracted. So the project more or less high-centered during the ML&P sale period. After Chugach took over, we went over to Chugach and said, hey, we've got this project we've been working on. We would like to work with the utility. Chugach very quickly said, oh, we like this project. This has lots of benefits for the port, for Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson, and for their local service. And that's where we've moved in. And we've worked closely with Chugach Electric to add ideas for the plan. So for example, the initial plan was our backup power generation was going to come from railroad engines. We were going to contract with the Alaska Railroad in the event of a grid outage to bring a couple of engines onto the port and use them as generators to power the port. That plan, when Chugach discussions started, their first thing was, well, we have a better idea than the engines. We have this Ship Creek power plant that is old but still functional but not very efficient. What if we were to dedicate that as a backup power plant? And it basically, we've had iterations of the conversation to where we've gotten today.
Great, thank you. That's really helpful. We're kind of getting it, at its
I
more
understand.
final stage. The last question I have is on page 2 of the AM, starting at line 3. It says Port is responsible for the equipment purchase, civil design, and construction, but all of that has to be done to Chugach's specifications?
Exactly.
Okay. I guess what I'm trying to get at here, and what I'm thinking through is there is some benefit to Chugach Electric in this in the end as well, but
Absolutely.
we're paying. And so I guess I'm just trying to see how, when we're benefiting Chugach, are we getting anything in return?
Yes. So to give you a little more history, when we applied for the DCIP grant application in the first place, we actually did it in conjunction with Chugach. So we were co-applicants. We worked on the grant application together, did all the planning, budgeting, and submission together, and the grant won the award. We then came back and the municipality basically said, we don't do shared grants. At which point Chugach dropped out as a grant recipient. We became the sole recipient. We had to come up with extra money in order to, that originally we thought was going to be coming from Chugach as part of our match. We've come up with that extra money. Our next plan was to say, okay, let's just hand the project over to Chugach and let them develop it. However, Chugach said, we really don't want, we're an electric company. We're not a civil construction company. We don't want the civil liability that's associated with doing the civil construction portion of this. So that's when we backed up again and said, all right, we're going to go to Chugach to do the improvements on their side of the grid, because that's the sort of work they do, and to do the base specifications and design of the battery so that we build the right battery that will fit into their system and that will work with their control systems. And then we will take responsibility for actually going out and contracting the purchase and installation of that battery. And then the basically putting the wire in right up to the interconnect point.
Okay, just make sure I track that. Chugach's skin in the game is they're getting their grid ready to be able to accept this, and that's on them.
It's a little bit more than that. They're actually putting in new switching that will let us island the port. And then they're also putting in controls that will let them control our microgrid from their control center and eventually move into a fully automated control system so that if, for instance, the Seagull lands on the wrong transformer at the port and shorts out one of our power systems, it will be able to switch around it instantaneously, and the battery will kick in to provide the power.
Mr. Johnson.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'll hold my thought.
Thanks. So I see the grant was for 5.3 million. This is for 3.6 million. Are we just utilizing 3.6 of that 5.3 capacity for this?
The 3.6 million is basically covering the cost of the interconnect equipment, the microgrid switches, which are all benefiting the port, and then a little bit of engineering work from Chugach to do the specifications. The remainder will be to purchase and install the battery.
Okay, the remainder of that 5.3 million.
The remainder, so we have 2.3 million of match plus the 5 point. So the whole project's about $7.5 million. So roughly half of it is going to be spent on battery purchase and installation, and the other half is on Chugach controls, switches, interconnect equipment, some transformers, that sort of thing.
Okay, so this 3.6 is to cover the 2.3 match that we have to provide, and then additional monies on top of that to cover the total project.
So the total match is the port is putting 2.3 million in. Of that project, the grant money itself has to be spent either on equipment or construction. It can't be spent on planning, permitting, that sort of thing. So we're using our match money to pay for the basic engineering, the site specs. We're having a GIS study, a geotechnical study done to make sure to know where we can put the battery, where it's seismically stable. For the NEPA process, that's all coming out of the port's money. And then the actual battery purchase and the construction to install it, and then the purchase of some of the Chugach equipment will be paid for with grant money. The way it breaks down, not to exceed $3.6 million will go to Chugach, and that will pay for basically the switching equipment, some transformers and other interconnect equipment that's necessary, and then the engineering required to specify our battery and to review our contract to say, yes, this meets Chugach's needs.
Okay, thanks. And then what's the useful life of this battery system?
That's a good question. The system itself, can go on into the foreseeable future. Individual batteries, the technology is changing very quickly. I will say one benefit we've gotten from this delay is the cost of batteries have gone down and the quality of the batteries have gone up while we've been spinning our wheels. So we're actually going to get a better battery out of this. I would anticipate that the life on this battery is probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 years before the battery cells themselves will have to be traded out. The basic equipment should continue.
And have you guys looked at what the ongoing costs of operational maintenance for this system will be?
That's going to be on Chugach largely, what we're moving forward, because the port is not an electrical operator. So the notion is that we're going to enter into a contract with Chugach to have them operate and maintain the battery on our behalf. Part of what they get out of it is that they can use the battery to help provide grid services. So for instance, if we have a solar farm that's coming in and they need to be banking up power during the day when the solar farm is generating for use at night, our battery could provide part of that. It's also part of why we anticipate this battery will eventually grow, because Chugach would like a much bigger battery, and we could potentially add that on. But in the event of a grid outage, that means we have that much more battery to keep the port services going.
So there'll be a contract between the port and CA for them to operate the system.
Yes.
And I assume you would,
And that's a future contract that is separate from this.
okay, but then they will also have some utility from the system. So I guess I would hope that in that contract, since they have some benefit from it, we're not just paying Chugach for a system.
Exactly. That's
they
right.
use for their
That is
interests. Okay.
part of the contract is, we have to recognize, harvest, and properly allocate the benefits of the battery. And Chugach will get benefit, and that's part of what they will get in the contract as opposed to money.
And Ben has been with us the whole way, working with Chugach to put the contractual arrangements in place. So, we'll protect the municipality's interests at all costs as we move this along and mature the whole relationship.
That raises up again, Chugach Electric, the interests of the municipality, the attorneys who they work for, and what agreements are being written. And it raises all kinds of questions that aren't present before us, but are getting to the devil is in the details, not in the short presentation that is provided to us. Because I am way less apt anymore to agree to approve any contract in which another party, we're told, has provided some assurance or some legal agreement. We haven't seen it, and then we get rolled completely. Randy, you had your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. Kind of in the same line as Member Johnson's questions. So the municipality, so Chugach is going to get benefit from the battery. They're going to be able to pull power out for whatever. Would that include if there was an outage of a generator somewhere, they could pull power out of the battery?
It's really not enough battery to do that.
Okay.
If the battery were to be substantially larger, then yes. The services that they're primarily going to be able to get out of this are going to be things like frequency control, and it will improve the quality of the power. The flicker that you get in your computer screen at home when the battery will be there to help reduce that sort of frequency modulation,
Okay.
so that it'll be a better quality of power.
Through the chair, just to clarify, all of that is a subsequent contract that would be dealt with under the operations and that relationship with Chugach. This is just the get the battery built portion of the contract, and not even the full get the battery built, but get the design specs from Chugach, get Chugach to build the interconnection equipment, and then we'll go out to bid to get the battery and get it built. And then once we got the thing built, then we'll enter into the relationship on how the battery will operate, who will receive the benefits from the operation of the battery, how that will be allocated. So multi-step process.
Yeah, so I imagine as you go down that road, you'll maintain a certain level of charge for the port's use. I mean, no sense them drawing it down and then pulling it out.
Exactly.
And if the battery was bigger, I assume if we have, let's say, cooking like gas issues, we need to go to a brownout or cut capacity, they could cut you off as an island. And then I assume if the battery is bigger, it would also help with like Chugach spinning reserves or anything like that as well.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, the spinning reserve is actually a big piece of it. One of the big issues that we have at the port is that we have a very dirty demand, meaning that we have these huge power spikes. So if you have 3 electric cranes lifting 30-ton boxes, if 3 cranes lift more or less at the same time, that's a huge spike in the power on Chugach's load. They always have to have enough spinning reserve to accommodate, if one of their turbines goes down, the biggest spikes. So that means they've got a lot of power that's being generated constantly that's theoretically never going to be needed unless something goes wrong. By having the battery there, the battery on the port serves as the spinning reserve and gets us into a lower rate. We don't have to pay for those spikes anymore because we'll handle them with the battery.
And one of the other benefits that's going to come out of this is, the other power users on the port that we have no indication now of it even happening is when ABI is stirring the cement in their dome with the auger, and when the petroleum docks are in operation and those pumps are running. That could all be happening at the same time as the ship to shore cranes are working, or it could be happening spread out. But as Jim said, it's an inconsistent level of demand, and they're responsible for making sure that the worst case scenario power is available. And this will help with the demand charges that the port users have to pay, because we're able to now take on some of that load. And when the new cranes get here, the new cranes generate power on the down. So we can capture that power in this battery plus whatever else is coming too. So all that helps us to cost less from a power standpoint and gives us the sustainability that we need to be survivable if something happens to the grid and we need to stay in operation.
Mr. Littlefield.
Thank you. I just had a quick question, and it all relates to the battery issue. Say we have a catastrophic event and we lose all power to the port. Will this battery support the port in its entirety, and for what duration?
So the initial battery is probably about 4 hours of port use if it was fully charged when the outage came during a normal port operation, say 3 cranes. We can stretch that out a little bit by doing some controls. We can ask ABI not to stir their cement, or tell Menzies not to pump fuel up to to Ted Stevens for a bit, because that's all electric power. So we can use some control issues to extend our time. The black start generator that we're talking about moving in, what that will do is once that generator is there, the battery will give us the life to keep the port operating while we bring the black start generator online. That generator would then take on the load or the bulk of the power production. We might still need to do some use management in terms of what we're not pumping fuel. Instead, we'll use trucks or trains to move the fuel to J-Bear or to Ted Stevens to save power. But we will be within this first step will give us an ability to take the generator to continue port operations in the event of a long-term outage.
Yeah. And the ultimate goal, though, is, to your point, for operations to continue without any interruptions whatsoever. And over the course of time, as we get from this first baby step all the way up to where we are a connected microgrid that's mature, we're collecting the data on what the power usages are and where the spikes are and where they're not. So we can look at where the load is, and generally speaking, when the load happens, and with the computers that get introduced, and with the switching that gets introduced in all of this process here, it's a smarter operation to keep the costs down as low as possible and keep us open.
Ms. Alzo.
Thanks. So I see our match on this is $2.3 million. Where did it come from?
Port funds.
Just
Yeah.
port revenue,
Right.
Monies you had. Okay, and are those revenues ones that have been paid through the tariff? So by the users?
Primarily.
Yeah, the tariff, not the surcharge.
Yeah, I figured as much. Okay. And then kind of somewhat with Mr. Johnson's question, you said that Chugach would be picking up any ongoing operational costs. So the primary ongoing costs for the municipality would be any equipment replacement or repairs or those types of things? I'm just trying to think. It sounds like it's.
That's the exact, I can't give you an exact answer because we don't have the final operating agreement with Chugach. And it's possible that we say, okay, maybe the operating agreement with Chugach isn't in our best interest and we find another way. But that's a contract that still needs to be negotiated.
Okay. Will the operating agreement come back before us?
Yes.
Okay. Why aren't these things writing in tandem then?
My understanding, Jim, correct me if I say this wrong, the goal of this process right now is to use the grant funds to build the battery. We're on a clock because of the grant timelines. Once we have the battery built, we have a physical piece of infrastructure owned by the port that theoretically we don't need Chugach to do. The long-term planning, because as you guys have heard, as the body has heard, the port has planned, this is step one of a massive project. But once we do step one, we own a battery, it's on site, it functions. And the question is how we operate it. That has not been addressed yet. The long-term plan is Chugach, but if that doesn't work, we find another way to use the physical infrastructure we own and have.
This doesn't make any sense then. So I'm just going to go how I see this and how I read this, right? $3.6 million to Chugach, but Chugach isn't buying the equipment. We
No,
are.
they are buying.
They're buying the
significant-
equipment.
No, some of the equipment. They are buying switches. They are buying some,
But that's not what this says. And this is where this is confusing and where this large of a contract award in an AM through sole source is really tough for us, okay? So what this says is it's a $3.6 million award to Chugach for purposes of the BESS project. But what it doesn't tell me is exactly what $3.6 million is going to be spent on. What it tells me is that to develop its microgrid and battery storage, the BESS system, the contract scope will be for them to provide the specifications. That's not a lot of money. Shouldn't be a lot of money. Will design, install, and commission interconnect facility and microgrid facility. Like, I have no idea how much money that is.
that's the bulk of the money.
Okay, and then but then where do we pay for the equipment out of? Out of this same $3.6 million pot?
No, that 3.6 million, not to exceed $3.6 million, pays for the Chugach the equipment that Chugach is buying to benefit the port. The microgrid switches, for instance, that will island the port, that does not benefit the overall port or the overall Chugach service group. That benefits the port because it lets the port island itself.
Okay. Yeah, and I think part of it is just, it says, and it's all meant to maintain and operate to provide negotiated Port of Alaska benefits. But my understanding, because we don't have the operating agreement here yet, is what those exact benefits will be. So this feels really scant on information as to how we're going to spend $3.6 million with Chugach. So I don't know. We're a little ways away out from that June meeting. If an A version, even if like there are cost estimates for these things, because I can't pick, I'm not an expert in this. I have no idea what those things cost. And I know you need flexibility within the $3.6 million, but it's hard for me to explain to anybody where that money will exactly go.
The bulk of that $3.6 million is electrical equipment on Chugach's side of the grid that on Chugach's side of the meter that benefits the port. So it will be the controls that will let them control the microgrid, turn it on and off from the Chugach headquarters. It will be the actual switches. It will be a series of transformers that are needed to step the power up and down to the port because of our port uses.
Great. Can we say that in here? I think that's what would be helpful, because I appreciate the explanation, but the document we approve and that lives in the portal doesn't tell us those things.
Through to the chair to vice chair Zalto, would you like that? You've got those 3 bullets right there. Would you like just an estimated value and amount of cost per each bullet? Would that be helpful?
I think that's a great starting point, but I think what I just heard Jim say is that the bulk of the cost is for not only the equipment, but putting it in and doing those pieces, right? And why that matters, because that's what's not necessarily in here. Remember, I'm coming at this as someone who doesn't know about a project you've been working on for a really long time.
Gotcha. So the short answer, if I may, is that the reason our project is paying for this material that Chugach is going to own is because they're a regulated utility. Expenses that they have to be paid. It's basically the cost causer, cost payer model. Because the port is causing that cost, we have to pay that cost for them. Our switches are not benefiting their overall user group. They're benefiting us.
Great. Again, that doesn't say that in here. So if it can say that in here, that is helpful. Thank you.
Ms. Braga.
I don't know if you described it and I missed it, but so eventually the Department of Defense wants to expand on this project, but right away they're not going to be part of it. Is that correct? but it would benefit them if we start it. So I wonder if they're kicking in any funding for this, or is that what the grant is from them?
That is what the grant is from.
Okay.
So the DOD really gets two levels of benefit. First of all, because we're a commercial strategic seaport, our operational capability is critical to the DOD mission in Alaska, the Arctic, around the world. If we go down, they have problems. By having our power system up and reliable, that makes us more reliable. That benefits their mission. That's the broader goal. That's what got us the DCIP grant in the first place. We're actually getting ready to go for another DCIP grant this year. That part of that grant will be for the plug, if you will, that will put the interconnect point where the JBER microgrid could connect into our microgrid so that we can share power back and forth, depending on what the needs are and what the crisis is, in the event of a grid outage. So that's where they would get a direct impact from our microgrid, in that they could potentially use our battery to help level their loads, or to the Black Start generator that Chugach has on our microgrid could potentially power part of the DOD facility.
Gotcha.
But that's, again, a future project. We're just enabling it.
And then I had one more thing. So if I think a hospital, and if the power went down, the life support equipment wouldn't run. And so are we talking freezers and refrigeration, cranes? You got 1 to 4 ships coming in daily. And the power, the big surge of power is needed when a ship is coming in to unload with the cranes and whatnot. But just give me a brief
So your
life support for the port.
your hospital analogy is excellent. And if you go to Providence and you go down into the basement, they have a large Caterpillar generator that, in the event of a grid outage, they'll turn their diesel powered generator on and produce power for the hospital so that they can keep functioning. Once we get our Black Start generator moved, that will be our version of that Caterpillar. Right now we have several small generators. We have enough to make the crane safe in the event of a power outage. We had a power outage, what was it, 2 weeks ago, Steve?
Yes.
While we were offloading ships, and we ended up, power goes out, we have boxes hanging in the air, and by box I mean a 30-ton container hanging in the air on a ship that is coming up at 1 inch a minute with the incoming tide. You need to move it. So we have a 1 megawatt emergency generator that takes us about 10 minutes to get it into gear and make the crane safe. So basically you can finish the offload, get it clear. You could lift the cranes up so they're not going to get tangled up in the ship. We've made the situation safe, but we're not operational. The battery will do that faster. We won't have to get that generator up because we can continue the power pretty quickly within seconds, minutes, so that we can make the vessel safe. Once we get the generator on, then we'll actually be able to continue the loading operation, even if the grid is down.
And even when there's no ships at the dock, there's operations that are drawing power down at the port. Every petroleum customer down there has a fill stand, and the fill stands need power, for trucks and in a lot of cases for rail. And those are operating even if there's nothing going on the dock. And they're moving fuel through the valve yard to back and forth to each other, even if there's nothing going on at the dock. So there's a pretty steady need for fuel, for electricity, to keep the port operating, even on the days when there's no ships there.
I appreciate the explanation.
Okay, I was going to say, for example, we're providing 3/4 of the fuel to Ted Stevens. That fuel, we have the capability of bringing it there by truck or train, but right now, when operations are normal, virtually all that fuel goes by pipeline. It has to be pumped up the hill because the airport is higher than us. That takes an electric pump. So that would be an operation that gets to continue if we have power. If we don't have power, then we go to the backup plan. We use the train or we use the truck.
All right, so I have myself back in the queue. If you go to the AM, those 3 bullets that were pointed out, which are the scope, it actually states CEA will design, install, and commission facility and microgrid facility. So the contract actually does appear to authorize construction, and there's no sense to me of where and how and what. That is really important because again, the substation you point to is within a rock's throw of at least 6 of my neighbors. So I would like more information to break that out. What is under the scope of this authorization to design, install, and commission interconnect facility?
So that is the work that is on the Chugach side of the meter. That Chugach considers normal electrical utility work that they're willing to take the responsibility and the liability for.
But we are being asked to pay for it. And so I
Because
have
it's benefiting the port.
a
Correct.
concern about what we are authorizing to be constructed. And I would like to understand what the specific construction is, especially considering 15 or 20 minutes ago, I was told there was no construction and we would see that later. And so there is some form of construction, and that is, I assume, on the substation in part, even though it's
The construction, we didn't say there was no construction. The construction on the Chugach side of the meter physically is basically some cement pads that will have the electrical equipment mounted on top of those cement pads. It's not significant civil construction. It's construction that Chugach says, okay, this is within our area of expertise. We're willing to take the liability for it.
and it's within close proximity to residential neighbors who exist in close proximity to the port and have a long history of trying to work with the port to understand what's coming so they can be prepared and don't get served destruction. So it is right there. Let us understand before we're asked to approve what that means more specifically. Second, it was stated that this is the first step in a massive project. So have we seen the scope of the massive project? Have we authorized the massive project? What is the massive project in detail enough that we can grasp as we're being asked to pay for what to me is $3.6 million is a large sum of money, or $5.3 million, a much larger sum of money. So that's real money. It's not just small, but if that's just a small part of a massive project, what are we actually authorizing here specifically?
When Ben said massive project, I had to bite my tongue not to step in and say, no, it's not really a massive project. It's a phased series of small projects that each have independent utility. So the battery by itself has utility for the port. It will improve reliability. It will reduce our power costs by taking the edge off of our demand charges. But it is also part of an ongoing project that when you add these smaller projects together, when you add in the generator, for example, that will give us the ability to have long duration port operations in the event of a grid outage. The battery by itself won't do that. The generator by itself won't do that. The combination of the two will do that. So while the generator has independent utility, while the battery has independent utility, when you put them together, you have a greater utility.
And so, this language about projects with independent utility raises red flags to me about the quote PEL projects that DOT has started to talk about and try to implement, in which they create these massive programs and with sub-programs within the program, each with independent utility. They then can start proceeding on projects like taking a whole row of houses in a residential neighborhood to serve a road that may never get built. And so that all raises up the question of, can we see somehow what the general scope of the broader project is, kind of as best can be defined in this document, the substitute version that comes forward.
And
So
that's
there's-
why I put the cartoon slide in. That is a cartoon because it's not a firm plan. It's a concept for the sorts of things that we're working toward. The technologies are changing and the markets are changing very quickly, and we're basically trying to prepare ourselves for the future. Everything that we're doing, we want to do in a way that's scalable and adaptable to future change. So for example, today, the port, about half of our volume is hydrocarbon-based fuel, okay? there is a high likelihood that that will change in the next 10 years. For instance, because aviation fuel is switching to sustainable aviation fuel, which is basically a carbon neutral fuel that is made with hydrogen that you get from a renewable energy source. You crack water to make the hydrogen, and then you use that to make your sustainable aviation fuel. We are trying to get our toe into the market so that we are able to understand and be ready for some of these changing fuel sources. We're not saying we're going to move to sustainable aviation fuel, but we want our system to be adaptable enough that if changes like that happen, we're ready for them. So the hydrogen pipeline, for example, is not part of any proposed project right now, but we are, in fact, going after a grant right now with the EPA Clean Ports Grant to test some hydrogen-powered and some electric-powered hostlers. That's the yard trucks that pull containers around the yard, because the market's changing. Diesel fuel is very likely not going to be the fuel of choice in 5 or 10 years. And given our cold climate, we ought to know what works. So we're going after this EPA grant to test hydrogen and electric and to see how it works with our climate and our duty cycle. That, surprise, surprise, is different than the Port of LA Long Beach, where a lot of these things have already been tested. They have a completely different duty cycle, a different weather condition. So what worked there does not necessarily work here.
So in sum, I'm supposed to tell my Government Hill neighbors, the port's message is trust us until such a time in the future that we come back with more information.
No, I'm telling you that we are working on coming up with a plan that will be flexible enough to meet the changing market.
No, I understand the value to the market and the energy needs of the port. I am asking the questions relating to the impacts on the neighborhood that exists in close proximity to the port and the scale of this, what's going to happen over time, so that they can be mindful of the operation as it evolves into several projects of independent utility that then become one large-scale massive investment that all works together in coordination for the interests of the port. But does it then end up with a storage place of PCBs that are going to leak into the school playground or other elements? I just can't grasp most of that from this very small analysis. And so, Anna, you were in the queue.
Yeah, thanks. Just briefly, a lot of this conversation specifically is reminding me of the relationship with, or sometimes lack of relationship with, the airport and West Anchorage. So I appreciate that other neighborhoods face this as well. And I guess I don't have, I see the value in this project, so I appreciate the briefing. And then again, I just keep coming back to, this is why we need things like master plans for the port. And I'm not saying again, because we have to stop what we're doing and do this planning process. But a lot of these conversations seem to revolve around the lack of that plan. And so the plan is a communications tool. It is a way to work through these priorities, and it is a way to communicate. And so it just feels like, again, this is one of those things where, for lack of a plan that does do that big picture, the master plan for the site, we end up in these conversations. So I just, again, would encourage that in the future we make time to make a master plan, because that's what these are for. And then the absence of those plans, and then the absence of us implementing plans in this city, is partly why we revolve around these conversations and they become conflicts. So I just want to express frustration, not because this is a bad project, but because this is why we end up in this place. And I just want to get to a spot where we are not continually in that place, and planning has a role. So that's all I want to say. Thanks.
Thus speaks the planner. So, yeah, I think that we're getting close on time. We have 5 minutes. I think we've heard what there is to hear. An S version or A version would be welcome that has some clarification on the matters. And Steve, would you like to take the last couple minutes to brief us on NES 1?
Sure, happy to. Well, I hope the word got out to everyone that we received the FONSI and the EA from MARAD earlier in the week. And it didn't take, I got an email from Pete Simons at MARAD at about 6 o'clock on Tuesday night. And the word was in the hands of Manson Construction probably by about 6:40 on Tuesday night, because they went to town starting on Wednesday morning, and the digging operation is going on. If you go out there now, and you're all welcome to come down and take a look. They've got their barges, moored to the barge mounted cranes, and they're doing as much digging as they can as fast as they can. So it's pretty exciting to see what's going on out there now. So we are out of the starting blocks on year 2 of the NES1 project. The goal for everyone is to do as much as possible this year. We're sort of racing beluga whales in the area season. We've still got some time, probably almost a month or so before that becomes challenging when the hatchery releases the smolt. But in the meantime, we're going to get a lot done. Everybody's goal is to not have to come back next year. Get as much done as we can this year, and or if they have to come back next year, it's not for a very long time. So, and I have to give props to Manson Construction. They have been absolute partners in this. You don't get that all the time when you get a contractor that's doing this magnitude of work. But they've been working with us all along, even on calculating what the delay charges will be coming from them. So that's going to be surprisingly low. What they gave us for April was way lower than what we had done algebraically, thinking the worst case was going to be. So we were happy to see that. So work is underway, and they're clearing out in front of all the sheets. You've got to get the pressure off the sheet pile wall before you can start to take those sheets out. And so I think we're maybe a month away, if not less, from watching this first of those sheet pile begin to come out. And the actual benefits of what NES1 are going to deliver to the port users is going to be obvious.
In sum, the next phase has actually begun, which is good news. So anything else? Hearing and seeing none, then we'll be adjourned. Thank you. We'll be convening back at 11:50.